In 1971, there were two congressmen who left the United States and traveled to Vietnam to see the troops who were fighting in the Vietnam War. While they were over there, they discovered something very troubling, which was that about 15% of the soldiers that they met were addicted to heroin. Later research went on to confirm that about 20% of soldiers were actually addicted to heroin, and over 40% had tried it at some point during their service in Vietnam. Now, when the congressmen returned home to the United States, they realized that there was a real problem going on and that they needed to solve it. And so they hired a team of researchers to look in and investigate further and then come up with a plan of action for what to do. And the researcher who was leading this effort was a woman named Lee Robbins, who her discoveries in this case went on to become quite famous because they completely upended the current knowledge of how addiction works and what drives it. What Robbins and her team found was that when the soldiers returned home from Vietnam, the re-addiction rate was only 5%. And this was the complete opposite of what the typical re-addiction rate was, more than 95% in most cases. So if you had a standard person who was living in a neighborhood in the United States, they were addicted to heroin and then they went into rehab, the odds that they would come back and get re-addicted when they returned home were over 90%. Meanwhile, these soldiers from Vietnam who were in an incredibly stressful situation, they came over after being heavy users of heroin and only 5% re-addicted. So what was going on here? Well, what Robbins ended up discovering was that the environment had a critical role on the behavior of the soldiers. When they were in Vietnam, they were surrounded in an environment where heroin was readily accessible. They were surrounded by other heroin users, so they were triggered and stimulated to use in a community setting. And they were also in an incredibly stressful war zone, which prompted and sparked many of the heroin habits as a way to reduce stress. So what they discovered was that the way to radically change your behavior is to radically change your environment. This is one of the main punchlines and discoveries of her research, is that whether or not we choose to perform a particular behavior is largely dependent on the environment that that behavior is in. Human behavior is incredibly contextual and heavily dependent on the situation in which it occurs. So while we often ascribe methods like willpower or some type of therapy as being useful for addiction, it often is the case that the environment itself is the trigger for the actual habit. Now, once we understand this, it opens up a very wide range of interesting things to consider when it comes to building new habits and behaviors. How does the environment that you live and work in right now shape and shift your performance on a daily basis? What type of actions are you surrounded by? Who are you surrounded by, and how do their actions and habits spark your choices on a daily basis? If we want to radically change our behavior, we need to radically change our environment. In the lessons to follow, I'm going to talk about a few practical ways to do exactly that. So stay tuned.